Welcome, everyone. This program is part of the Presidential Primary Sources Project, and today's program is Women's Rights Are Human Rights, Human Rights Are Women's Rights from the Clinton Presidential Library. And the Presidential Primary Sources Project is a partnership between Internet2, the National Archives, and the National Park Service, and it is a free educational program that we hold from January through April. And this is just a reminder that by participating in this webinar, you agree to be recorded, streamed, broadcasted, and archived as part of the program series. And we do have all of our recordings of our previous programs on our YouTube page. This one will be on there as well. And we are so excited to have you all here today, and we want to have you participate as much as possible. And one of the main ways we're going to use participation today is with the chat box. And that looks like a little message bubble at the bottom of your screen. That being said, we really want to keep all of our comments on topic and related to what the presenter is talking about. And another thing we encourage is if you would like to rename yourself, go ahead and do that so we can call you by the right name and make sure that we're recording your attendance here today. And if you need help with that, you can also put that in the chat and we can help you out. And finally, if you would like to be on video, so you can wave or we can see you on camera, please drop a note in the chat and we can promote you to a panelist. Thanks again so much for joining us today. And here's our website here if you would like to find out more information about the program, or if you'd like to register for future programs. And yeah, we're going to pass it over to Kathleen, our wonderful presenter today.
Thank you, Casey. I am Kathleen Pate. I am the education specialist at the Clinton Presidential Library in Little Rock, Arkansas. And I would love to see in the chat where you are joining from. It's always interesting to see how many folks are joining from different places. There we go. I see Texas. I see Wisconsin, Michigan. All right. So today is a great day to be talking about Hillary Rodham Clinton's speech in Beijing, China at the 4th UN Conference on Women for a number of reasons. It is March is Women's History Month, and then also tomorrow is International Women's Day. So we're going to explore how this speech came to be, the impact that it had, and the ongoing legacy. So first, let's talk about the UN, so that's United Nations World Conference on Women. Since 1975, the UN has organized 4 of these conferences. When they started planning the 4th conference, they worked on selecting a location. They asked nations around the world to create delegations. And here we see the delegation briefing book from the conference. That's something that we have in our collection. So China offered to host the conference, and they were selected, but it was a little controversial. So there were concerns about China's record on human rights, particularly human rights related to women and girls and the one-child policy that China has in place. China was motivated in part by trying to repair their image after the 1989 Tiananmen Square protests. So these were protests against the government, where the government violently put down the protest, ended the protest. There's a very famous photograph you might be familiar with, where there is a single man and there's a tank moving toward him. So that's from the Tiananmen Square protest. So the controversy around the selection also was controversial within the United States, and whether or not the United States was going to send a delegation. They ended up selecting UN ambassador to the United Nations. I'm sorry, U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Madeleine Albright, who would later become the first female Secretary of State, as the chair of the U.S. delegation, with the First Lady, Hillary Rodham Clinton, appointed as the honorary chair. And what we're seeing here is a letter from the Association for Women in Science encouraging President Clinton to appoint the First Lady to serve on, to be a part, to head this delegation. And they gave some specific reasons there. So, lifelong leadership on children's, family, and women's issues. American women would be proud to see her leadership in the important global forum. The world will see the importance placed by the US on this World Conference. So lots of reasons given. And you'll also note, what's the date? When was this letter sent? So the conference was held in 1995, September of 1995. But it was planned for over a year, right? So June of 1994, right? So they're already getting this together. So this is a really big deal, this much planning going into it. So I mentioned that the controversy about China's selection as the site had an impact in the United States, and there were members of Congress who were opposed to US participation and opposed to the First Lady being a part of the delegation, to the point that they threatened to block funding for the trip. So what we're looking at on the right-hand side of your screen is a letter from a representative from the state of Georgia. And he has written to President Clinton, and he is saying, I'm surprised and extremely disappointed to learn that the First Lady will attend the United Nations Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing. An American presence at the conference would be wrong because it both endorses and promotes a radical feminist agenda that is anti-family. So this gentleman was affiliated with, this representative was affiliated with the Republican Party, but there were members of the Democratic Party who also opposed the US delegation taking part and the First Lady being involved, including Nancy Pelosi. So this is an old school email. The format looks a little different than what we see today, but this is an email internal, so between two members of the Clinton administration, and they're talking about Nancy Pelosi serving in the House of Representatives as well, later becoming Speaker of the House. And Nancy Pelosi is very upset that we may send the First Lady. Her concern is China's human rights abuses. Right? So they're trying to, there's lots of opposition to this, to her participation in the conference. So in addition to these, something else happened that made people say that the United States should not send a delegation. And that was in June. So the conference was in September. So roughly 3 months before the conference, a Chinese American activist, his name was Harry Wu, was arrested and detained in China. There was public outcry for his release, and there were concerns, you know, if the First Lady goes, if the US delegation goes to this conference and Wu is still imprisoned, what message is that sending? Now, in addition to hearing from members of Congress, representatives from both parties, The White House also receives letters from members of the public, concerned citizens. And so that's what this is that we're looking at here. And I'm going to read it since it's in cursive. And it says, that's interesting. Maybe it's to Hillary because, yes, the letter is directed at Hillary. Your presence at the woman conference would benefit the mass of women. You not going will only benefit one man. And I think she was in a hurry when she wrote this letter. I do know that it was a woman. It says will. She also included underneath her signature, she said, I did not vote for Bill Clinton. No politics involved. So she is saying, I didn't vote for your husband. That's not why I'm writing you this letter. I'm writing you this letter because your presence at the conference would benefit a huge number of women. And she's saying not going really only benefits, in this case, Harry Wu. So the First Lady was adamant about going, meaning she wasn't going, she wasn't willing to let that go, right? She was absolutely determined to go to the conference. In August, China convicted Wu, but rather than imprison him, they expelled him. They kicked him out of the country. And so we see this declassified memo from National Security Advisor Tony Lake to the president regarding Hillary Clinton's participation in the conference. So what are the dates that you see on this document? You see a couple of different dates on this document. I've circled some up at the top. What do you see in that circle? I see the White House. I see Washington underneath that. I see 1995. Yes. What month? What month in 1995? August. Yes. And I see two different dates in August. I see the date that it was written. And then I also see the date that it was seen by the president. Did you notice that stamp in the circle that says the president has seen? Yes. So it was written on August 24th. The president has reviewed it on August 26th. Hillary Clinton gave her speech, the keynote address in Beijing on September 5th. So we know the earliest that the decision was made by the dates on this document, August 26th. So how many days ahead did she know for certain that she was going to be able to attend? So if we take 5 days in September, 26, there are 31 days. So basically she had 10 days. Yes. Yes. Birchwood Blue Hills Charter School, 10 days. Yes. All right. So here is a little an enlargement, a part of this memo. And it says, The purpose of the memo is to obtain your approval of the First Lady's participation at the Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing, and to obtain your agreement to decline a meeting with Harry Wu. The State Department concurs. Right? And then it says, for background, it says, with Harry Wu's release, we believe the major obstacle to Mrs. Clinton's participation has been removed, and we recommend that she travel to Beijing for the women's conference. So, the President of the United States, the duties of the President are defined in Article 2 of the Constitution. And that sets out that he is the chief executive. He is responsible for enforcing or executing the laws, but he actually has 3 other duties, and I like to call them the 4 C's. So he's chief executive, he's commander-in-chief, he's our chief diplomat, and he's our ceremonial head of state. And so chief diplomat and ceremonial head of state are the ways where the president is our top representative in our relationship with other countries. So the president appoints ambassadors. The president negotiates treaties and trade agreements. So in the end, the decision, if the First Lady, if the US delegation were going to Beijing, that was his decision to make. And Lakewood Elementary has pointed out, that's not very long. 10 days is not very long. And it's actually about to get a little shorter, a little more busy. So this is Hillary Rodham Clinton's calendar for August 1995. And we see that starting on August 15th, that the president, the first lady, their daughter, so the entire first family are on vacation in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. Looking at this calendar, why do you think they typically go on vacation? And this is true to this day. The Clintons usually go on vacation the second half of August. Looking at the calendar, what else is going on? What else might make it a good time to be away from the White House? It says Congress is on a break, right? Congressional recess. So the president not only enforces or executes the laws, the president tries to make sure that the laws that are passed are laws that he believes are good and right. And so the president wants to be in Washington working when Congress is in Washington working. So August, when there's a congressional recess, is a great time for the first family to go on vacation. Now, when the first family goes on vacation, that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't do any work. So you might have noticed on the 26th, they've got the Women's Suffrage 75th anniversary. So this is an event where both the First Lady and the President spoke. The 26th is also that date we saw that the President had seen that memo. So we know that the President was continuing to work while he was on vacation. And this photograph captures the conversation between the Clintons. They've just learned of Harry Wu's expulsion from China, and they're talking about whether or not the First Lady is going to go to China. Okay, so we know it's only 10 days. Got to get that speech written, on vacation. So the president doesn't write all of his own speeches. And he has people called speechwriters. There's a whole team of speechwriters. And Hillary Rodham Clinton is the first lady to have a team of speechwriters. And Lisa Muscatine was the first speechwriter for a first lady. So I want to point out that when their vacation is wrapping up in Wyoming, they're going to Hawaii. And I want to look at the First Lady's schedule for September to think about why they might have gone to Hawaii. What's going on? What do you see here? I'll make it a little bigger for you. A World War II remembrance. So thinking about what you know about World War II, what you know about when it started and when it was over. Yes, there's also Labor Day, Pearl Harbor, right? So the start of World War II is Japan attacking the military base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. So it makes sense for this remembrance for the president and first lady to go to Pearl Harbor. And what they are commemorating is something that happened in 1945. It didn't happen at Pearl Harbor. It actually happened in Tokyo Bay in Japan. What do you know that happened 50 years before 1995? 50 years before 1995 would be, yes, Japanese surrender. Japanese surrender. So they're in Hawaii. They go on the 31st. They're there through the 3rd. And that speech, Hillary Rodham Clinton is giving the keynote address on Tuesday the 5th. It's kind of a tight timetable. All right, so we see that they were continuing to work. I mentioned Lisa Muscatine, and we know that this is a draft. We know that she was the primary speechwriter on this speech. We know that this draft is by her because we see her initials, LM, draft, and it's draft number 4. So this is one of the later drafts, and we can see Hillary Rodham Clinton's handwriting. Okay, so they're talking about, they're really focusing, let me go back here, focused on emphasizing, defining, and affirming human rights as inextricably. So there's no way to separate human rights from the well-being of women and girls worldwide. That's what inextricably linked means. You can't separate them. So we can see a few changes that she made. Let them look at the women gathered here and at, and that word is Hairou. So that's another place in China where additional people were gathered. And then she decided that rather than saying there are some who wonder why the lives of women and girls matter, to change to be there are some people who wonder whether the lives of women and girls matter to economic and political progress around the globe. And then what do you think this arrow means? Like this arrow that's pointing up and pointing down at the same time. Change the order. Yes. Switch the order. Yes. So she had some ideas about how she wanted the speech to be different. So when it comes to giving the speech, She is introduced by the person who is the conference director. There are approximately 1,500 people in the room. And in her autobiography, which is called Living History, she talks about how she was unprepared for the silence of the crowd during the first part of her speech. Part of that is due to she's giving the speech in English. Some of the people in the audience speak and understand English, but some of the people in the audience are listening to a translation. They have on headphones and they're listening to a translation of her speech. So she speaks, then they hear the translation. She speaks, then they hear the translation. But as she moves further into the speech, to the core of the speech, there's a refrain, and it's met with, as the words are repeated and people know what she's saying. Oh, what's making the translation? That's a really good question. It's actually people making the translation. So there are people in the audience who they're probably not sitting in the audience, but they are in soundproof booths. They're listening on headphones, and then they are speaking into microphones. So they're listening. It's actually a really tough job. They're listening to her words, and then they're speaking them in another language. And that feed is going to the people that speak that language. So many years ago, I went to a conference in the United States, a small meeting of about 20 people, half of whom were from Russia. And so in the meeting, there were 2 people in roughly soundproof booths who were translating. So when I spoke, that the people who spoke Russian knew what I was saying and vice versa. And I was chastised for speaking too quickly because it makes it difficult to translate. Okay, so as she gets to the core of her speech and with the refrain, people start to know what she is saying, right? They start to recognize the words, and that is met with cheers and applause. And I want to show you just a little bit of the speech now.
I believe that now, on the eve of a new millennium, it is time to break the silence. It is time for us to say here in Beijing, and for the world to hear, that it is no longer acceptable to discuss women's rights as separate from human rights.
Actually, I want to go back just a second.
I believe that now, on the eve of a new millennium, neighborhoods and workplaces, there are some who wonder whether the lives of women and girls matter to economic and political.
I thought I saw in the clip, I thought I saw in the clip maybe someone who was translating. But let's go ahead and move to the next slide. So the people in the room erupt in cheers and applause, but not everyone was happy about the things that she said. In particular, she made references to human rights violations. She didn't say that these violations were being committed by the Chinese government, but it was pretty clear that that's what she was implying, or that's what she was suggesting. And so the speech was being broadcast outside of the room, and they cut that. And then they also censored what was shared nationwide in China. So people in China outside of that room didn't hear the full speech, may not have heard any of the speech. So there's a photograph here with Hillary Rodham Clinton, First Lady, speaking to journalists following the keynote address. So some journalists praised her speech, in part for the clear and what they consider to be bold stance, linking the rights of women and girls to human rights, right? The little clip said we can no longer consider women's rights to be separate from human rights. But others criticized her, saying that the speech in no way helped the women and girls in China due to censorship, meaning that those people didn't get to hear or see the speech, that it didn't have an impact on their lives. However, at the conference, the UN adopted the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. And this is a framework that's still being used today to push for women's equality. So women being treated equally, women being treated fairly around the globe. It also had an impact in the United States. So following the fourth UN Conference on Women, President Clinton created the Interagency Council on Women, and that was taking that Beijing plan and seeing how those goals, objectives, the steps could happen in the United States. So when it says international plan on domestic level, domestic means within the country, within the United States. And Hillary Clinton was First Lady for several more years. So President Clinton was elected in 1992, re-elected in 1996. So he served as president from January of 1993 to January of 2001. And during that time, Hillary Rodham Clinton continued her advocacy. She worked with governments. She also worked with non-governmental organizations. That's an NGO you see there. And really tried to get, really pushing for more attention on women's issues. So I mentioned that March is Women's History Month, that tomorrow is International Women's Day. But the third reason that I wanted to talk about this speech is that we have an exhibit currently at the Clinton Presidential Library entitled Women's Voices, Women's Votes, Women's Rights. Does anyone remember what anniversary when I said that President Clinton and Mrs. Clinton both spoke when they were in Wyoming? It was the anniversary of women's suffrage. Does anyone know what the word suffrage means? It's kind of a weird word that we don't use very often. Right to vote. And it was an anniversary. August 26th is the day that the 19th Amendment was added to the Constitution. Does anyone know what year the 19th Amendment was added to the Constitution? (1920) Yes. Yes. So in 1995, they would have been commemorating what anniversary? Right? So 1995 minus 1920 is 75 years. Yes. Okay, so they were commemorating the 75th anniversary. So this exhibit, Women's Voices, Women's Votes, Women's Rights, was originally supposed to open to the public in August of 2020, which would have been the centennial, or actually it was, even though the exhibit didn't open, the centennial of the 19th Amendment. What does that mean? How many years? How many pennies? How many cents in a dollar? Centennial is 100 years. So 2020 marked the centennial of the 19th Amendment and the 25th anniversary of the Fourth UN Conference on Women, and Secretary Clinton's speech there that really resounded across the globe. So the exhibit looks at women's suffrage, the modern civil rights movement and the role that women played in that, women in politics, domestically, so in the United States, but also globally. It looks at women who are activists today, including young women. It includes 18 quilts that were created specifically for the exhibit. And so that's what we're looking at here. And it's not a quilt like you think of a bedspread, but it is a work of art. We call it fiber art. And so this is a depiction of Hillary Rodham Clinton at the Fourth UN Conference on Women in Beijing. Now, Secretary Clinton, I keep calling her Secretary Clinton because after she was First Lady, she served as a senator, a US senator from New York. And then she ran for president in 2008. She lost to Barack Obama, but she lost the Democratic nomination to Barack Obama. But for his first term, she served as Secretary of State. And when you're talking about someone who's held multiple offices, you always refer to the most prestigious office that they held. So I've been talking about work that Hillary Rodham Clinton did as First Lady, but nowadays we refer to her as Secretary Clinton because she was the Secretary of State for 4 years. So in conjunction with the exhibit that opened in September of last year, Secretary Clinton, her daughter, Chelsea Clinton, both came to the Clinton Presidential Library and Museum, and they held a summit on December 2nd. And it was about contemporary issues, so things that are happening today related to voting rights, related to women's health, related to women's education, women's leadership around the globe. So it's still something that Secretary Clinton is very passionate about. All right. So a lot of the information that I've shared with you today came from the Clinton Digital Library. So this is a great resource because it's an opportunity to look at primary sources held by the Clinton Presidential Library, which is a part of the National Archives, without leaving home, right? So these are the records that have been reviewed, released, and digitized. And so you can see some things here. For example, you see daily schedules for the president, for the first lady. That's where I pulled those calendars from. You see topical research guides and digital library exhibits. There is a DLE about the Beijing speech. So if you want to know even more than what I've shared with you today, you can visit that. So that is a great resource. I also want to let teachers, educators know that the National Archives has a new initiative, relatively new initiative, called Civics for All of Us. And this week, so fourth and final reason that I'm excited to be talking to everyone today is that this week is the first nationwide observance of Civic Learning Week. And we've got some special programs. There was actually one earlier today that you should be able to see the recording of now, kind of a kickoff session at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. But year-round, we offer a variety of webinars that connect to the Bill of Rights, the Constitution. And in addition to those webinars, you can also request programs for your classroom. And you can see in the chat, we've got the link there for the digital library, and then also for civics.archives.gov, which is going to tell you about all those programs. And we offer them for K through 12. So there's each, there are 4 programs, 3 to 4 programs at different grade levels around the Constitution and around the Bill of Rights. Tomorrow, I'm going to be leading a webinar that's aimed at middle school students, so 6th through 8th grade. I'm going to be talking about the Constitution and voting rights. So that'll be an interesting conversation. So I want to open up the floor to questions. I do also want to point out that I'm happy to visit with you in the future. Our regular website, in addition to the digital library, our regular website is just clintonlibrary.gov. My email is just my first name dot last name at nara.gov. And then I want to recommend that you follow us on social media. So we have Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. We also have a YouTube channel. So that's where I pulled that clip of the speech from. In addition to having historic records, historic video recordings on our YouTube channel, we also have recordings of programs that we do at the Clinton Library. All right, so are there questions in the chat? I know that I've shared a lot of information, and I do appreciate the interaction in the chat, but I'd love to hear more if you have more questions. Do people react differently to her speech's legacy now than they did back then? I think so. I do. You know, one example is the shirt that I'm wearing. It's probably hard to see, but it actually says women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights. And this is a t-shirt that we sell at the Clinton Presidential Library and Museum. And her speech continues to resonate, maybe even more than it did at the time that she gave it. So I think people are more familiar with it now and see the impact that it had. Sometimes it's hard when things are happening to know what will have a lasting impact. That's the interesting thing about history, is what gets remembered, what gets talked about 5 years later, 10 years later, 25 years later. So absolutely, I think people do. Does she ever visit our museum? She does. She does. She was there in December. Actually, the picture I showed you was her and Chelsea Clinton. And she visits, the former president visits as well. They like to interact with the public. They like to interact with students. So it's really great when they're on site. Do all First Ladies focus on women's rights? Not necessarily, but Hillary Clinton was certainly not the first. One of the features in our exhibit, the Women's Voices, Women's Votes, Women's Rights exhibit, actually looks at the work that Eleanor Roosevelt did. She was appointed to I don't know if she was officially our UN, I think she may have been officially our UN ambassador. But she was a part of the United Nations Human Rights Declaration, and that included a lot of things about women's rights. But I've got to get to this next question. Are you saying that the Clintons are still alive? Yes. President Clinton is still alive. Hillary Rodham Clinton is still alive. They are both what we call baby boomers. So they were born after the end of World War II. So President Clinton was born in August of 1946, and Hillary Rodham Clinton was born in October of 1947. So what do their children do? So they have one child, they have a daughter. Her name is Chelsea Clinton, and she also advocates for women's rights. She's actually written a series of books called She Persisted. And so there's some picture books, so like for younger kids, but then there are also some chapter books. And the picture books, there's one called She Persisted, there's one called She Persisted Around the World, and there's one called She Persisted in Sports, and there may be another, there may be 4. So those are picture books that talk about multiple women who did really cool things, and then the chapter books are on a specific woman, and there are a bunch of those. The Clintons live in New York now. So when they left the White House, they made plans to settle in New York, and that's how Hillary Rodham Clinton was able to run for the Senate to represent New York. So they live in Chappaqua, New York. All right, y'all had lots of good questions. Are there any more? Oh, cool. My mom just told me she met Bill Clinton in real life in 1999. Yes. And he would have still been president in 1999. So that's cool. So President Clinton was president for most of the 90s, right? So he was elected in November of 1992. And then he served 8 years. So he was in office from January of 1993 all the way through January of 2001. So he was president for most of the 90s. All right, other questions? I really appreciate everyone coming out today, taking time out of your day, out of your classroom.
Yeah, it looks like there's no more questions. So
All
great
right.
questions, everyone. And thank you so much, Kathleen, for taking your time to give us your expertise. Really, really awesome presentation. And thank you to everyone who has joined today, who has participated or attended. We really appreciate all of your participation. Yeah, so have a great day, everyone. And
Thanks.
hopefully see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.